It was another disappointing playoff finish for the Philadelphia 76ers as they were swept out of the first round by the Boston Celtics in the NBA's Orlando bubble. Although they didn't have Ben Simmons, most people expected them to compete better than a sweep, and it's time to start really evaluating what the future looks like for this Philadelphia team. Welcome back, everybody. It's Courtside TV, and today we're going to be evaluating the future of the Philadelphia 76ers. With no healthy Simmons, Embiid was the star of the Sixers' first-round playoff series, and for the most part, I thought he actually played pretty well. This season has been plagued with questions about chemistry issues surrounding Embiid, Simmons, and Al Horford, and despite many of those things, I think Embiid still put together a pretty solid season. When Embiid's healthy and firing, he's definitely a top 10 player in the league, but he's had a lot of consistency issues throughout his career, as well as just a lot of health problems. He played in 51 out of the team's 73 games this season, which is actually pretty good by his standards, but he's still going to need to prove that he can stay healthy if he wants to continue to be the face of this franchise. He missed the entirety of his first 2 seasons in the NBA and didn't play much in his 3rd year, but when healthy, he is definitely an all-star caliber player. Ben Simmons has also struggled with health at points throughout his career, and it showed up again with him missing the postseason after being injured in one of the seeding games. He missed his entire rookie year to injury, but played 81 and 79 games in his 2nd and 3rd seasons, which is basically the entire year. Simmons has had some bad luck with injury his rookie year and now this season, but I wouldn't consider him necessarily an injury-prone player. Simmons is a heck of a player when he's on the court, though. He's incredibly long, athletic, great on defense, he's switchable, he's a great passer with good court vision, and he's got a lot of skills that you would look for in a superstar player. Now, the problem with Simmons is when it comes to his shooting ability, and we all know it. Simmons doesn't really seem equipped or really even like he wants to shoot three-pointers. With the way that things have changed in the NBA, especially in recent years, the three-pointer is an essential shot for many players in the league. Simmons is one of those rare players who seems to get by without it, but it would definitely take his game to the next level if he could develop any sort of consistent jump shot. And it's not just from three-point range, too. The majority of his shot profile consists from within 3 feet of the rim. He really is only taking layups and dunks, and it would diversify his game and round him out a lot more if he would just extend that out even just a little bit, taking on those mid-range jumpers and eventually stretching his range out to the three-point line, which he hasn't really shown a willingness to do so far at all. There have been questions over the past year about whether or not these two players actually fit together and whether or not you can win a title with these two as your best players. Both of them are at their best in the post-up game with their back to the basket, and many people have raised questions about whether or not that's effective, having your 2 star players both wanting to play that style and neither one of them has much of a jump shot. Is it time for the 76ers to consider trading one of the two? I'm not sure. If it was up to me, I don't think I'd do it yet. They're both still young and they've got a couple years left on their deals. I would continue trying to find players like they had actually a couple years ago, players who can shoot more around them and really spread the floor for these two players to be able to dominate the paint a little bit more. It is unbelievable to me why they would let a guy like JJ Redick go. He was the perfect complement to those two guys, being able to stretch the floor and hit those three-point shots, which really spread it out and allowed Embiid and Simmons to do a lot of their work inside with more efficiency and just more skill overall. Because Redick was able to stretch that floor out to that three-point line, taking attention away from the defense out there. This season, the problem with the Sixers was that they really had no shooting threats on the outside, and so people could just clog the paint and defend them that way. Nobody on the Sixers starting 5 is a shooting threat, and the way that teams defended them basically brought that to light. Now, they have guys like Furkan Korkmaz on the roster, and they tried to complement this by bringing in Alec Burks, who is a decent shooter, but they just needed more of those players. They really didn't have enough outside shooting threats, guys who could create their own shot from the perimeter and just were a threat to knock it down from range, which basically just made it really easy to guard this team. Their biggest move last offseason was bringing in Al Horford, and a lot of people, myself included, thought that was a pretty solid move at the time. Horford is a solid veteran, he rounds out their starting 5, and it allows them to play big when a lot of other teams were playing small. It ended up not working out at all whatsoever. Horford was eventually removed from the starting 5 and ended up coming off the bench as Embiid's backup. He just wasn't a good fit at power forward for this team, and it goes back to that fact that they don't really have a shooting threat on this roster. It was just an awkward fit from start to finish, and Horford is now seen as a bad contract that the Sixers are probably going to want to get off their books, but they'd probably have to attach an asset in order to do so. So their big free agent signing last summer turned into somebody they'll probably need to give up a draft pick in order to give away. Last season they also traded for and then ended up giving a big extension to Tobias Harris. Harris is okay, but he's certainly not a max level player, and this move becomes even worse when you find out that they elected to keep him instead of Jimmy Butler last offseason. I know there was probably chemistry issues with Butler that made him want to leave. He wanted to go to the Heat, and it didn't seem like he wanted to come back anyway, but just losing Butler in free agency doesn't mean you have to go out and hand a max contract to Tobias Harris. He's fine, he's a pretty good scorer, pretty good defender, but he doesn't really have a super great or reliable jump shot, and he's kind of playing out of position in this oversized starting five. Does it sound familiar? Harris has now become another overpaid player on a long-term contract that the team will probably want to get rid of, but they won't be able to unless they attach another asset to get rid of that deal. Their other core player is Josh Richardson, and he struggled at times with consistency and finding his role and fitting into this starting five, similar to a lot of other Sixers players this season. At least he's not as expensive as some of these other guys, and he's on the younger side, so he's not a negative asset for the team by any means. Maybe they look to trade him this offseason for a piece that is a little bit more of a shooter that can help round out this team, or they attach him to one of their bigger contracts, as an incentive to get off either the deal for Harris or Horford. But maybe they keep him too. He's a nice piece that a lot of contenders would love to have, and if the Sixers are looking to contend again next season, I would imagine that they would probably keep him unless they decide to swing for the fences with another big deal. And that's really the question, right? Are the Sixers looking to be contenders again for next season? I know that Twitter is ready to blow up teams the second they run into any sort of adversity, but in my mind, I think the best course of action for the Sixers is to just keep this core together at least for a couple more seasons and just see what they can do. Looking at this cap sheet, everybody signed long term, and that can be seen as a good or a bad thing. Regardless of whether or not Embiid or Simmons are unhappy about the current situation, both of them are signed for the next multiple seasons. They're here for the long term. So unless they get really unhappy and request a trade, and even then the Sixers won't necessarily be, obliged or required to make that move, considering both of them are under contract. I mean, Embiid, has 3 more seasons after this one, and Simmons has 5. So their core is under contract, and even if they do decide to request a trade, they don't have to fulfill that request. Both of those core pieces are still young, and they have time to put together, a decent team around these two guys, but it gets a little bit more troubling when you look at their other contracts. As I mentioned, both Harris and Horford are signed to these massive long-term deals, and they're not expiring anytime soon. I mean, look at that. That's 3 seasons for Embiid and Horford, 4 for Tobias Harris, and 5 for Ben Simmons, all left on this team's books. They are capped out for the foreseeable future, and unless they do decide to attach a pick or a valuable asset to one of Horford or Harris's contracts, this is pretty much the Sixers team for the next couple of seasons. So they're going to have to make it work, and the next step is finding a coach and a system that can really make this team function with the personnel that they have. Before I really get into coaching and exact trades, I do want to mention a couple of their free agents for this upcoming offseason. So Alec Burks, I wouldn't expect them to try too hard to bring him back. He was pretty good after they brought him in a trade at the deadline, but they didn't really get to see much of him with the season being suspended and all. He had some nice showings in the bubble, but I wouldn't really expect them to prioritize bringing Burks back, and they definitely won't be wanting to pay him anything more than they have to because, looking at this cap sheet, they are totally maxed, and I wouldn't imagine them they would be willing to commit a long-term salary to any of these free agents. So that's Alec Burks. Maybe they do want to bring him back. He would be probably the highest priority out of any of their free agents. Kyle O'Quinn, I don't think they really care. He didn't really play too much for them this season, and especially after they moved Horford to the bench, O'Quinn didn't really have a role, and I don't think he will with this team next year. Raul Neto, he was fine. He was a decent backup point guard, but again, he's not going to be a priority for them. And Norvel Pelle, he was also pretty good, but at 27 years old, I don't really know how much value he has to the team. So they don't really have too much to worry about this offseason. Potentially, actually looking at that, Glenn Robinson has a player option. He'll maybe opt out. I'm not sure what he would decide to do. If he does take it, that's fine. He'll be a decent player for them. But if he does opt out, maybe they well, I mean, if he opts out, then that means he probably doesn't want to come back. So there's that. And I would also imagine they would be trying to extend Furkan Korkmaz. Like I mentioned earlier, he's pretty much the only shooter on the roster, and he's had a decent role for this team, so I'd imagine they would probably want to bring him back. So the Sixers have a couple of options this offseason. They can either elect to blow it up, or they can run it back. I can't imagine they'd be too enticed to trade either Simmons or Embiid. I get it, people on Twitter and diehard fans are really pushing for, teams to make blow it up moves as soon as possible, and myself included. I love talking about trades, and that's some of my favorite, stuff to discuss about the NBA, but I don't think it's quite time for them to do it yet. Both of the players are still young, and they're both signed long-term. The Sixers have all of the leverage here, and so I would anticipate that they would probably just continue to run it back until they're really forced to make a move. When you look at, the past couple of seasons for this team, last year they lost on a last-second buzzer beater to the eventual champions in Game 7. If Kawhi Leonard doesn't hit that quadruple bounce from the corner, they're playing in overtime with potentially a chance to go to the Eastern Conference Finals against the Bucks and get to the finals. So that was kind of, they had health and everything was working for them last year. And so that's really what the ceiling for this team was. And then this year they had that injury to Simmons, but you can't just point to that. They had a lot of chemistry issues this year, and it stems from the departures of guys like Jimmy Butler and JJ Redick last offseason. Losing those guys, I think, was pretty short-sighted for the GM and the people in charge. It just doesn't really make sense to lose those two guys, and so I think what they need to do is just continue to find those shooters and build around this team, because I think they have a pretty solid foundation, but they're going to have a tough time, finding those pieces to put around these guys with the contracts that they have on their books right now. Like I mentioned with Harris and Horford, they're pretty much capped out, and so unless they're moving one of those two, it's going to be tough. Now, a lot of people have been talking about this, and I think this is a great move for this team if they're able to pull it off, and that would be going after Chris Paul. So I would look at trying to interest the Thunder in potentially taking on the salary of Horford or Harris in exchange for Paul. A trade that I think would potentially work would be Chris Paul for Al Horford, Josh Richardson, and Matisse Thybulle. Now that seems like a lot of value for the Sixers to give up for an aging guard in Chris Paul, but here's why I think this makes sense. Paul only has a few years left on his deal. He's under contract for not as long as Horford, so they can get that salary off the books quicker, and it gives them more flexibility in the near future. And basically, that's where the difference in value comes from. Even though Paul's making more money, Horford has 3 years left on his deal, and so his contract is hefty for a team to take on. Paul also absolutely fits better with this team. He can be that floor general and, be that guy who's setting up Simmons and setting up Embiid and their other players for more open looks. It just seems like he fits a lot better than Horford, who they're basically paying a ton of money to be a backup center, a mediocre backup center. He was not good this last season, and Chris Paul turned in, one of the better performances of his career, especially at his age. So I think he's just a much better fit, and they're going to need to give those additional assets in order to get that money off the books for Horford, as well as to just make up that difference. So I know they're giving up Richardson and Thybulle, which is a rookie that a lot of people were excited about, and that kind of cuts into their depth, so I'm not sure if they would do this because of that reason, but at least it's an idea. I just think they should look for moves to extend their championship window for the next couple of seasons, because with the way things are right now and the way that their salary cap sheet is looking, they're going to have a tough time contending with the roster that they have, and we just saw why this year. So I do think there are moves to be made for this team, but I don't think they necessarily involve trading Embiid and Simmons. Now, if an amazing offer came across the table, maybe they do consider doing it this offseason, but I just don't think that they would be willing to do that. And especially Elton Brand, he's been disappointing as the GM so far, and if he makes a move like that and it doesn't work out, he absolutely loses his job. So I think it's in his best interest to, keep both of those players on the roster at least for the next, year, maybe two, and, see how it goes. but I would be trying as hard as I possibly could to, make moves surrounding around Al Horford and around Tobias Harris to potentially upgrade the roster, by getting players who fit a little bit better than those two do. And then as far as coaching goes, they have their vacancy because they fired Brett Brown. And, they have a couple directions they could go in here. They could either, reach for a coach with championship experience and has, not necessarily even championship experience, just playoff experience. Somebody who's been there before, who knows how to deal with star players and who could maybe maximize, this unique roster. Or they can go with somebody on the younger side who hasn't maybe had a chance at head coaching yet, but has a chance to, kind of break out and is one of those young, like up and coming coaches. They could potentially go with that and see what they could do with that team. It all depends on what they hear in interviews, really. It's been reported they're interested in Ty Lue, and I think he would be a good fit, but really I think he's a good fit for any team with a head coaching opening, so they would have to prove that, they're the best destination for him. But I don't think he's a bad option. And then like I said, I think they should just look for maybe a coach on the younger side who, I'm not too familiar with coaching searches in the NBA and coaches who, necessarily haven't had a chance yet. Just a name that I've heard floated is Darvin Ham from the Bucks. I know that a lot of teams had been considering him. And then I believe there was a guy on the Spurs staff that a lot of people have been talking about as potentially a candidate to gain a head coaching job this offseason. So there's a couple options of guys who haven't necessarily had their chance at head coaching yet, but maybe they would be able to work well with the unique roster that the Sixers have and maximize the strengths of this roster. But really, I think the most important thing for them to do this offseason is just continuing to look for shooting, because around guys like Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, that's the best skill that you can have. And we just saw what JJ Redick meant to this team, and his absence really hurt them this year. So I would just continue to look for those shooters. I know that every team is looking for shooters, so it's going to be hard to come by. But definitely I would extend Furkan Korkmaz, like I mentioned earlier, keep him, and then just continue to look for those guys who can hit three-pointers, and maybe that involves potentially flipping Harris and Horford to try to obtain those guys, and I think that those would be good moves for them to do, even though they might have to attach additional assets, some of their younger guys like Josh Richardson or Matisse Thybulle, or putting draft picks on there in order to entice teams to take on those longer-term contracts, but that's really what I think they should do. So the Sixers are in a very unique spot. No other team really has this type of team going into next year, and it's not just because of the style that they play, right? They've got a lot of money on the books and they're locked in for the next couple of years. They have their two stars under contract, but what they've done this season really hasn't worked, and so there are some moves to be made here. It'll be interesting to see what they do, but I don't necessarily think this is a completely blow it up scenario quite yet. I don't think they're to that point. I think the most realistic plan of action would be to shop Horford and Harris aggressively, and keep Embiid and Simmons, and just try as hard as you can to make them happy. I don't think either of them are to the point where they request a trade yet. Obviously, a trade request from either of them kind of changes things, but like I mentioned earlier, they don't have to fulfill that request. They're both under contract for the next couple seasons, and the team can just say, hey, you're coming to work, you're coming to these games, and we're not going to trade you now, because they have the leverage to do that. And so I don't think we will see a Simmons or Embiid trade this offseason. It's always a possibility, but if I had to bet, I don't think either of those things will happen. More likely, I do think that they will try to move Horford as aggressively as they can, potentially going for Chris Paul if the Thunder decide that they're going to sell off their pieces after this season. While they were pretty successful, but maybe a Chris Paul trade would be in the works for Philly. I think that would be a pretty good move for them. But other than that, that's pretty much my thoughts on the Sixers. So thank you guys all very much for watching. That's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And next time we're going to be discussing whoever loses the series between the Jazz and the Nuggets. So we are going to have a Game 7. That's going to be played on Tuesday. And whoever loses that series, that's who I'm going to be talking about in my next season preview. So whether that's the Jazz or the Nuggets, that's who we'll be back with next time. Anyway, that's going to be it for me today, and I'll see you guys in the next one.